Most towns have a story they're known for. Some are remembered for famous battles, some for famous people, some for landmarks that attract tourists every year. Erwin, Tennessee is remembered for something far stranger. In 1916, a circus elephant named Mary killed her handler. A few days later, thousands of people gathered in Erwin to watch a 5-ton elephant be publicly executed by a railroad crane. More than 100 years later, it still sounds unbelievable. But the older I get, the less interested I become in judging the people who stood there that day, and the more interested I become in understanding why human beings do the things they do. Today, Robert and I are riding into Erwin, and along the way I want to talk about that story. A little self-reflection, and why it's often easier to examine other people's faults than your own. Let's ride.
Oh, you hear that? You may not have heard that. If you did, you know what it was. If you don't,
As the road carried us towards Erwin, I found myself thinking about how easy it is to judge history. Most of us do it. We look back at previous generations and immediately recognize mistakes that seem obvious now. We see poor decisions, flawed thinking, unnecessary cruelty, and moments where people acted in ways that make us shake our heads. The benefit of hindsight is that it gives every generation confidence. Looking backward is easy. Looking inward, that's a little harder. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself this question: what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I'm about to criticize?" I've always thought that was an uncomfortable piece of wisdom. Not because it's complicated, because it's honest. Most people don't struggle to identify flaws in others. We see them immediately. The challenge is recognizing those same tendencies in ourselves. And that's exactly what came to mind when I started thinking about Mary the elephant. The basic story is famous around these parts. In September of 1916, the Sparks world-famous show Circus was traveling through East Tennessee. During a parade stop, Mary the elephant became involved in an altercation with the handler and killed him in front of spectators. The details varied depending on which account you read. Some reports suggest the handler was inexperienced, others suggest he stuck the animal. Regardless of exactly what happened, the result was tragic. Then came the reaction. Fear spread quickly, anger followed, pressure mounted. The circus eventually traveled to Erwin, where local leaders and circus officials decided Mary would be executed. Thousands reportedly gathered to watch. Families, workers, children, curious spectators. A crowd standing beneath the mountains watching something that today feels almost surreal. Whenever I hear that story, I can't help but laugh a little at the absurdity of it. A circus elephant hanging from a railroad crane sounds like something somebody invented after too many drinks around a campfire. And yet it happened. But after the initial shock wears off, another question starts to emerge. How certain am I that I would have acted any differently? That's where things become uncomfortable, because history has a way of exposing your arrogance. We assume we'd be the wise ones, the compassionate ones, the rational ones, or the courageous ones. But every generation believes that, and every generation eventually discovers its own blind spots. The people of 1916 weren't monsters. They were just people. People shaped by fear, emotion, social pressure, culture, assumptions. The same forces that influence us today. Sure, technology changes, but human nature doesn't change nearly as much as we'd like to believe. That's one reason I think history matters. Not because it allows us to sit in judgment over previous generations, but because it forces us to confront ourselves. It asks uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what beliefs do I hold simply because everyone around me holds them? Where am I following the crowd without realizing it? What assumptions have I accepted without examining? What biases am I blind to? Those questions aren't easy, and honestly, most people spend their entire lives avoiding them. Self-reflection is difficult because it threatens the stories we tell ourselves. Most people see themselves as reasonable, fair, open-minded, objective. The problem is that everyone sees themselves that way, including people who clearly aren't. Human beings are remarkably good at spotting flaws in others while remaining blind to their own. We recognize arrogance in someone else while calling it confidence in ourselves. We recognize stubbornness in someone else while calling it conviction in ourselves. We recognize anger in someone else while calling ours righteous frustration. The labels change depending on whose behavior we're evaluating. That tendency isn't new, it's ancient. Which is why one of Christ's teachings remains so powerful. In Matthew 7, Jesus asks, "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye?" It's actually a funny image if you think about it. A man walking around with a giant plank sticking out of his face while criticizing someone else's tiny speck. People listening to Jesus probably laughed. But beneath the humor was a serious warning. Before judging others, examine yourself. Before correcting others, examine yourself. Before condemning others, examine yourself. But notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say ignore truth. He doesn't say abandon discernment. He says begin with humility. That's an important distinction, because humility doesn't weaken truth. Humility protects truth from becoming arrogance. The road curved through the Appalachian foothills while those thoughts lingered in my head. One of the reasons I enjoy rides like this is because motorcycles create space for reflection. Not because motorcycles are inherently profound, they're machines, but the road slows life down enough to hear thoughts that normally get buried beneath distraction. Modern life is noisy. Phones, news, politics, entertainment, algorithms competing for attention every waking minute. Everybody has an opinion about everybody else. Everybody is evaluating somebody, criticizing somebody, arguing with somebody. Very few people are spending the same energy evaluating themselves. And that's dangerous, because growth almost always begins with self-awareness. Not self-hatred, not obsession, honest self-awareness. The willingness to ask, where am I wrong? Where am I blind? Where am I being prideful? Where am I fooling myself? Those questions require courage. Far more courage than criticizing a stranger. The psychologist Carl Jung observed something similar when he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." I think there's truth in that. The faults we react to most strongly often reveal something about our own hearts. Sometimes it's insecurity, sometimes it's pride, sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's a trait we secretly struggle with ourselves. It's worth paying attention to. The older I get, the less convinced I am that wisdom comes from having all the answers. I think wisdom often comes from asking better questions. And one of the best questions we can ask is, what if I'm wrong? Not because we're always wrong, but because humility creates room for growth. Arrogance doesn't. The mountains around Erwin have watched generations come and go. They've seen wars, economic hardship, floods, growth, decline, families rise and disappear, entire communities change. And through all of it, human nature remains remarkably consistent. We still wrestle with pride, fear, anger, judgment, the desire to be right, the desire to belong, the desire to avoid difficult truths about ourselves. Maybe that's why stories survive. Not because they're entertaining, although many are. They survive because they reveal something timeless about human beings. The elephant story isn't really about an elephant. Not anymore. It's about judgment, assumptions, group thinking, fear, the temptation to react before reflecting. And ultimately, it's about humility. The willingness to admit that we're not as objective as we'd like to believe. The willingness to acknowledge that every generation has blind spots, including ours, especially ours. As we rolled closer to town, I found myself grateful for the roads like these. Not because they solve life's problems, they don't. But they create perspective, and perspective is valuable. The road reminds me that most things aren't as simple as they first appear. People aren't as simple. History isn't as simple. Life isn't as simple. And maybe wisdom begins the moment we stop pretending otherwise. If you've watched this far in the video, I greatly appreciate it. Please go ahead and hit that like button. Go ahead and subscribe so you can see more videos similar to this one. The story of Mary the elephant is strange enough that most people remember it forever. But for me, the most interesting part isn't the elephant. It's the people. The fears they carried, the assumptions they made, the decisions they justified. Because if we're honest, those same tendencies still exist today. Maybe in different forms, maybe in different situations, but they're still there. Marcus Aurelius was right. Before we find fault in others, it's worth asking what fault of our own most closely resembles the one we're criticizing. That's not weakness, it's humility. And humility is where growth begins. As Robert and I continue deeper into Appalachia, I think that's one lesson this old road keeps teaching me. Slow down, pay attention, question your assumptions, and be honest enough to examine yourself before judging somebody else. Until next time, keep the shiny side up. Adventure awaits just around the corner. Jarhead Jed signing off.